It's 3 in the morning. Maria is lying in bed, her husband sleeping beside her, and she should be sleeping too. But she can't. For the 7th time, in 10 minutes, her hands automatically move toward the phone on her nightstand. She doesn't even realize she's doing this. It's as if her fingers have a will of their own. The blue light from the screen illuminates her tired face as she endlessly scrolls through videos that don't interest her, through comments from people she doesn't even know, through news that only increases her anxiety. 40 minutes later, when she finally manages to put down the phone, Maria feels worse than when she started. Empty, guilty, irritated with herself. Why did I do this again? She whispers in the dark. What's wrong with me? But Maria doesn't know that there's nothing wrong with her. She doesn't know that her inability to resist this impulse isn't a personal failure, but the result of billions of dollars invested in neuroscientific research to discover exactly how to hack her brain. She doesn't know that some of the brightest minds in the world have spent years studying how to make her dependent, how to make her always come back, how to turn her attention into money. Maria thinks she's simply relaxing, distracting herself, connecting. She doesn't realize that she's being systematically stripped of her capacity for concentration, for deep reflection, for genuine presence. She doesn't suspect that she's experiencing the most sophisticated form of slavery ever invented, one that makes the slave passionately defend their own chains. If you've ever lived a version of this scene, if you've ever felt powerless before a device that promised to serve you but seems to be controlling you, then you need to know the truth about what's really happening. Because this isn't a story about technology addiction. This is a story about how human freedom is being secretly abolished one click at a time, while we applaud the progress that's enslaving us. To understand the genius of this new form of control, we first need to understand how slavery worked in the past and why it eventually became unsustainable. For millennia, human control depended on brute force and physical coercion. The Egyptian empires built their pyramids with slave labor. The Romans expanded their territory through military subjugation, and European powers built their colonial fortunes through direct exploitation of conquered peoples. This model of domination had a fundamental characteristic. It was expensive and inefficient. Maintaining a slave required food, housing, constant surveillance, and, most importantly, the perpetual risk of rebellion. A slave knew they were a slave, and this awareness always carried the seed of resistance. History is full of revolts like that of Spartacus, which almost brought down the Roman Empire, or the Haitian Revolution, which proved that even the most brutal systems of oppression could be broken by the human will for freedom. The fundamental problem with physical slavery was that it created a clear antagonistic relationship between oppressor and oppressed. There was a defined line between who controlled and who was controlled, and this clarity inevitably fed the desire for resistance. The Industrial Revolution apparently freed humanity from this primitive dynamic, replacing slavery with wage labor and promising that technological progress would eventually lead to universal emancipation. During the 20th century, we witnessed political revolutions that seemed to confirm this trajectory. the abolition of slavery, the emergence of democracy, labor rights, universal suffrage. Each conquest seemed like a definitive step toward a world where human beings would finally be free to determine their own destiny. But something extraordinary happened on the way to this promised utopia. As physical chains disappeared, much more sophisticated psychological chains were being forged. And these new chains had a crucial advantage over their predecessors. They made the prisoner believe they were free. The transformation began quietly in the second half of the 20th century with the emergence of applied behavioral psychology and the science of persuasion. Scientists like B.F. Skinner discovered that human behavior could be predictably shaped through carefully calibrated systems of reward and punishment. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, applied these discoveries to the field of propaganda, creating the foundations of the modern advertising industry. For the first time in history, there was a science for influencing human behavior on a mass scale, and this science was being applied not to liberate, but to control minds in ways that the controlled themselves couldn't perceive. The revolutionary insight was simple but powerful. Instead of forcing people to do something against their will, it was much more efficient to make them want to do exactly what you needed them to do. This principle found its maximum expression in the digital era. The technological platforms that today dominate our attention are products of decades of research in neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and addiction engineering. Each infinite scroll, each notification, each like is carefully designed to activate the same neurological circuits that respond to addictive drugs. But here's the brilliant trick. Unlike traditional drugs, which eventually generate tolerance and lose their effectiveness, social media algorithms are constantly adapting, learning from each click, each pause, each moment of hesitation to become more efficient at capturing our attention. They know our behavioral patterns better than we know ourselves. They know when we're vulnerable, when we're bored, when we're seeking social validation, and they use this intimate knowledge to keep us engaged, consuming content, and more importantly, generating data that can be monetized. But modern psychological slavery goes far beyond social media addiction. It permeates all aspects of modern life through a phenomenon that Harari identifies as the religion of data. Gradually, without realizing it, we transfer our most important decisions to algorithms. We let apps tell us where to drive, what to eat, who to date, what music to listen to, what products to buy. With each transfer of autonomy, we convince ourselves that we're gaining convenience and efficiency, and but we're also surrendering our capacity to think independently, to make authentic choices, to develop our own critical judgment. The paradox is devastating. The smarter our devices become, the dumber we become in exercising our own intelligence. Consider for a moment how you make decisions today compared to 20 years ago. When was the last time you got physically lost and had to use your own intuition and orientation capacity to find a way? When was the last time you memorized an important phone number? When was the last time you spent an entire afternoon without consulting any electronic device, letting your mind wander freely without external stimuli? For most of us, These basic experiences of cognitive autonomy have become almost impossible, not because someone prohibited us, but because voluntarily, enthusiastically, we surrendered these capacities in exchange for technological convenience. We are like the bird that, raised in captivity, loses the ability to fly even when the cage is opened. Modern psychological slavery is particularly insidious because it operates through the illusion of choice. We believe we are free because we can choose between Netflix or Amazon Prime, between iPhone or Samsung, between Uber or traditional taxi. But these choices are superficial, cosmetic. The fundamental structures that shape our thinking, our desires, and our priorities remain outside our conscious control. It's as if we were in a restaurant where we can choose any dish from the menu, but the menu was carefully crafted by someone who wants us to make specific choices that benefit their interests, not ours. Freedom of choice becomes an illusion when the available options have been pre-selected by forces we're not aware of or have power to influence. The most disturbing aspect of this new form of control is how it feeds on our noblest impulses. Our need for social connection is transformed into addiction by social networks. Our desire for knowledge is exploited by algorithms that feed us information confirming our prejudices. Our aspiration for self-realization is channeled into consumerism disguised as personal expression. Our legitimate concern for efficiency and productivity is used to make us accept levels of monitoring and control that would be unacceptable in any explicitly authoritarian context. We are controlled through our virtues, not our vices, which makes resistance psychologically much more difficult. This dynamic becomes even more complex when we realize that many of the architects of this new form of control genuinely believe they are improving the world. Technology executives who design addictive algorithms don't see themselves as modern drug dealers, but as innovators who are connecting people and democratizing information. Behavioral marketing specialists don't consider themselves manipulators, but professionals who are helping companies better understand their consumers. This collective rationalization creates an additional layer of protection for the system, because even those who could resist or reform these practices are convinced they're participating in something fundamentally beneficial. Psychological slavery is also sustained by a powerful ideology that Harari calls dataism, or the religion of data. This modern belief postulates that the free flow of information is the supreme good, that more data always leads to better decisions, and that resistance to information sharing is fundamentally retrograde and harmful to progress. Under this ideology, privacy becomes selfishness, personal autonomy becomes inefficiency, and any hesitation to fully embrace technological integration is seen as irrational fear of change. Dataism creates intense social pressure to voluntarily participate in our own subjugation and labels any resistance as ignorance or paranoia. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this new form of control is how it adapts and evolves in response to resistance. When people start worrying about privacy, more sophisticated privacy policies emerge that create an illusion of protection without fundamentally altering data collection practices. When users develop tolerance to certain forms of manipulation, new methods are developed using artificial intelligence to find even more subtle points of vulnerability. When resistance movements emerge, they are quickly co-opted, commercialized, or fragmented through techniques that were perfected precisely to neutralize organized dissent. It's a system that learns from its own mistakes and becomes more efficient with each escape attempt. The scale of this transformation can only be understood when we consider the numbers involved. Billions of people now carry devices that constantly monitor their location, behavior, preferences, and even emotional states. This voluntary and ubiquitous surveillance generates amounts of information about human behavior that exceed everything any totalitarian regime in history could dream of collecting. And this information is not just being used to sell us products, but to predict and influence our future behavior in ways we don't always understand or approve. We are witnessing the emergence of what some academics call surveillance capitalism, an economic system that profits through the extraction and manipulation of human behavioral data. In this new paradigm, our thoughts, emotions, and relationships have become natural resources to be exploited. Every search we make, every video we watch, every relationship we form or end generates valuable data that is processed by algorithms to create detailed psychological profiles. These profiles are then used not just to show us targeted ads, but to influence our political opinions, our career choices, our romantic relationships, and even our perception of reality. We are simultaneously the product being sold, the worker generating value through our data, and the consumer being manipulated to generate even more data. What makes this situation particularly concerning is the speed at which it's accelerating. Artificial intelligence is becoming exponentially more sophisticated in its ability to understand and manipulate human behavior, while our capacity to understand and resist these technologies remains relatively static. We are in a race where our cognitive autonomy is being outpaced by the speed of technological development, and each passing day increases the gap between our ability to control these tools and their ability to control us. But recognizing the reality of modern psychological slavery shouldn't lead us to despair or determinism. Human history has always been a tension between forces that seek to control and forces that seek to liberate. The difference today is that the tools of control have become much more sophisticated, but our fundamental capacity to resist and transcend imposed limitations remains intact. The first step to freedom has always been recognizing one's own slavery. When you can see the chains, you can begin to work to break them. The central question is not how to return to a pre-technological past, which would be impossible and undesirable, but how to develop a more conscious and intentional relationship with the tools that shape our mind. This requires the development of what we can call psychological literacy, the ability to recognize when our attention is being manipulated, when our desires are being artificially stimulated, when our emotions are being exploited for commercial or political purposes. Just as we learn to read words so we wouldn't be deceived by malicious texts, we need to learn to read the patterns of psychological manipulation that permeate our digital environment. This psychological literacy begins with simple but revolutionary practices, regular moments of total silence without any digital stimuli to reconnect with our own thoughts and feelings, active questioning about why we want to do certain things, especially when these desires arise right after interactions with electronic devices, developing the capacity to tolerate boredom and discomfort without immediately seeking distractions, deliberate cultivation of relationships and activities that exist completely outside the digital world. These practices may seem small, but they represent acts of fundamental resistance against a system designed to keep our mind constantly busy and reactive. Modern psychological slavery can also only be effectively combated through collective action. Just as the abolitionist movements of the past required social organization and sustained political pressure, liberation from algorithmic manipulation requires entire communities to develop critical consciousness and create viable alternatives to existing control systems. This can involve everything from digital cooperatives that prioritize user well-being over short-term profits, to legislation that regulates the most predatory practices of the technology industry, to educational movements that teach critical thinking skills specifically adapted to the challenges of the digital age. More deeply, we need to rediscover and value those human capacities that technology cannot replicate or replace: intuition, genuine creativity, emotional wisdom, spiritual connection, authentic relationships based on real presence instead of digital mediation. These dimensions of human experience not only make us more resistant to technological manipulation, but also remind us why it's worth fighting for our psychological autonomy. When we experience moments of true inner freedom, when we feel our own capacity to think independently and act based on consciously chosen values, we recognize the invaluable worth of what's at risk of being lost. I need to ask, as we explore these ideas together, at what moments in your life do you feel most intensely this tension between technological convenience and personal autonomy? Those moments when you realize you're acting automatically, following algorithm suggestions, without really questioning whether these actions are aligned with your deepest values. I know many of us keep these reflections to ourselves, perhaps for fear of seeming paranoid or overly philosophical in a world that values efficiency and connectivity above contemplation. But here, in this space, your deep reflection is welcome. Share in the comments. I question my technological autonomy when your honesty can illuminate the path for someone going through the same inner tension, showing that we're not as alone as we think in our concerns about technology's impact on our lives. Modern psychological slavery represents both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of our time. It's a challenge because it operates through mechanisms so subtle and seductive that most of us don't even realize we're being controlled. But it's also an extraordinary opportunity to develop more sophisticated levels of self-awareness, critical discernment, and conscious autonomy than any previous generation in human history. Never before have we been forced to think so deeply about the nature of mental freedom, about the difference between authentic desires and manufactured desires, about what it truly means to think for ourselves in an age of ubiquitous algorithmic influence. The future of human freedom doesn't depend on rejecting all technology, but on developing the wisdom to use technological tools without being used by them. This requires a collective maturity that our species is still learning to develop, the capacity to embrace the genuine benefits of innovation while resisting its most manipulative and dehumanizing aspects. It's a delicate balance that requires constant vigilance because the forces that profit from our psychological dependence never rest in their efforts to create even more sophisticated forms of capturing our attention and shaping our behavior. Perhaps the most important insight we can extract from this analysis is that freedom is not a state we achieve once and then automatically maintain. Freedom is a daily practice, a conscious act of resistance to all forces that seek to diminish our capacity to think independently, feel authentically, and act based on our own inner wisdom. In the age of psychological slavery, this practice becomes more urgent and more difficult, but also more precious and more transformative. Slavery may have changed form, but our fundamental impulse for freedom remains intact. The question is not whether we will be able to resist the new form of control, but whether we will have the courage to recognize it while there's still time to make different choices. History teaches us that the most apparently invincible systems of oppression eventually fall when enough people wake up to their reality and decide they deserve something better. Our awakening may be quieter than revolutions of the past, more interior than exterior, but it is no less real or less powerful for that. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the psychological and philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser ways to live amid the transformations we're witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth where we can develop together the mental clarity and inner autonomy necessary to navigate wisely in these extraordinary times. Join us in this continuous journey of awakening and conscious resistance. Your presence and reflections make a difference in this community of people committed to developing a more conscious and intentional relationship with the forces that shape our mind and our society. We have no experience in history of a less intelligent species that manages to control a more intelligent species. Horses don't control us. Cows don't control us. We control them. What happens when we create a more intelligent species than us? These super intelligent AIs. So maybe in the short term, it will be good for our economic growth and prosperity. But what happens in 20, 30, 50 years when millions of super intelligent AIs run the world? They manage the financial system, the military system, the cultural system. How will humanity be able to coexist with a new super intelligent species? This is the big question. Wars of conquest, which were taboo since 1945, are coming back. The relatively stable liberal order of the early 21st century is collapsing. Instead of a cooperative order based on universal values, global institutions, and international laws, we are entering into a super competitive, chaotic world in which only one thing matters, and this one thing is brute force. Leaders like President Trump envision the world as a collection of fortresses, with each country separated from the others by high walls. Financial walls, like tariffs, military walls, cultural walls, and physical walls. This vision may have certain advantages, but it fails to address one key problem. Walled fortresses are seldom friendly. Thousands of years of history teach us that each national fortress would probably want a bit more security, prosperity, and territory for itself at the expense of the neighbors. And in the absence of universal values, global institutions, and international laws, how would rival fortresses resolve their disputes? For millennia, the vision of the world as a collection of fortresses always led to exactly the same outcome: a never-ending cycle of wars, with powerful empires conquering their weaker neighbors and eventually fighting each other for supremacy. This is already beginning to happen all around us. Wars of conquest, which were taboo since 1945, are coming back.
So what is the most common portrait in the world? What is the most famous face in the history of humanity? It is the face of Jesus. I mean, there are more portraits of Jesus than of any other person in the history of the world. Billions and billions produced over centuries in cathedrals and churches and homes, and fully 100% of them are fictional. There is not a single authentic, truthful portrait of Jesus anywhere. We have no portrait of him from his own lifetime. The Bible doesn't say a single word about how he looked like. There is not a single word in the Bible, whether Jesus was tall or short, dark hair or blonde or bald, nothing. All the images, and it's one of the most famous faces in history, it all comes from the human imagination. And it's still very successful in inspiring people and uniting people. Could be for good purposes, charity and building hospitals and helping the poor, but could also be for bad purposes, crusades, persecutions, inquisitions. But either way, the immense power of a fictional image to unite people.